Some of those charismatic and Pentecostal leaders, many of them are also televangelists. I think people like Paula White and others who built these giant ministries, some of which go on TV and, offer prayers and ask for funding.
What's your income? How much you're spending? Where are you putting it? And if I don't see tithes and offerings at the top, so there's your problem right there. You're robbing from God.
Decide that freedom will never be taken away from the church. I'll tell you, the church is strong. The church can stand together. And it's time the church tells the government to get off the back of the church.
They have the ability to mobilize a lot of people. People trust them. People follow them. It seems pretty clear from Trump's messaging early on that he understood the importance and power of this voting bloc.
Hey, y'all, and welcome to The Amendment, a weekly conversation about gender, politics, and power from the 19th News and Wonder Media Network. I'm your host, Errin Haynes. So in case you haven't heard, Donald Trump is running for president, and a lot of people are really excited to vote for him in November. One group in particular that is a critical part of his base are white evangelical Christians. Over the last 40 years, evangelical Christians have become an influential voting bloc. White evangelical support for Donald Trump exceeded 80% in the 2016 election. And Trump appears to be playing into this. He often ends his rallies with speeches that feel like sermons. Now, let me stop here and say, not all evangelical Christians think the same. Not all evangelicals support racist, sexist, or homophobic legislation. The intensifying politicization of the evangelical movement has been too much for some, and many are leaving the church. Still, the stronghold that Donald Trump has on this large segment of white voters of faith comes as a bit of a surprise to those who are not in the community. So I really wanted to talk to somebody who understands the evangelical community and can help us understand how they fit into this political moment. So this week, I'm talking with Sarah McCammon, NPR national political correspondent and author of The Exvangelicals, Loving, Living, and Leaving the White Evangelical Church. Welcome to The Amendment, Sarah.
Hey, Errin, thanks so much for having me.
So I want to start by breaking down the numbers. Almost 70% of Americans identify as Christian, but only 30% identify themselves as evangelical Christians. And 1 in every 3 American evangelicals is a person of color. Now, in 2016, you covered the Republican National Convention for NPR, and you witnessed in real time how the evangelical support for Trump grew. At the time, I can remember there were a lot of questions on how so many devout Christians could support someone who would really be considered amoral in their eyes. Why is Trump their guy?
Right. And, I covered that campaign for NPR. And at that point, I was more than a decade past being what I would call an evangelical Christian. I'd had my own complicated and kind of private wrestling with what that label meant for or didn't mean to me, which I talk about in the book. So by 2015-16, when I'm covering this primary, I, remembered that history very well. I was thinking about it a lot, but I wasn't really part of this movement anymore. And yet I was covering it because, as you say, there were so many questions swirling around what white evangelicals would do about someone like Trump. They make up such an important part of the Republican base, such an influential and powerful part, and have for a long time. But Trump, as you say, seemed to be so antithetical to everything that evangelicals said they stood for. And, I remembered well being a teenager in the 1990s and the response of prominent evangelical leaders and many Republicans who were aligned with the evangelical movement to former President Bill Clinton's moral failings, to the Clinton-Lewinsky affair. I remember the outrage at that and the calls for character in a president. And then, to be covering the Trump campaign and the Republican primary almost 2 decades after that, I was thinking about that a lot. And I, like so many people, was wondering how this community that I had come from would respond. And I think the short answer, Errin, is that evangelicals support Trump because he achieves their goals for them. He produces what they've been trying to achieve for a long, long time. I think, of course, the best example of this is the overturning of Roe v. Wade. This is something he promised to do if he had a chance when he was running for president. And he followed through. He appointed 3 conservative Supreme Court justices. Roe was overturned, of course, after he left office. And this is something that he has repeatedly bragged about in front of evangelical audiences. He says, nobody else could get it done, but I got it done. So I think many evangelicals see him, some of them describe his character in different ways. Some of them see him as maybe a repentant sinner or a baby Christian, as James Dobson, the influential evangelical leader, once put it. Others just freely admit that he's not a perfect person, but they say that that isn't as important as achieving their objectives in through the electoral process, through the political process.
Yeah. Okay. So that's really interesting to hear how what white evangelicals are telling themselves about Trump. What are the narratives that evangelicals tell themselves and others about their position in American society?
When you look at data over the last several decades, as you mentioned, Christianity, religious affiliation, which in this country is mostly Christian, right, or has been for most of the country's history, that's on the decline. White evangelicalism has been shrinking for the past 20 years or so, but Christianity across the board is getting smaller. It's a smaller share of the population, and certainly white Christianity. You know, the Christian or American culture and American politics used to be dominated by white Christians. But what's happened in the last several decades is we've seen, first the rise of the civil rights movement, which provided more equality for people of color. We also saw the women's movement, the sexual revolution, which meant huge changes to the ways that people thought about sexuality and the family and the patriarchy. And at the same time, the country was becoming more diverse and less religious, which are two separate trends. I want to be clear. There are many, many, of course, religious people of color, but these are big picture trends that the country's been seeing certainly all of our lives. And many, some historians and pollsters who pay attention to these things have argued, and I think pretty effectively, that what's happened is many white Christians, especially conservative ones with sort of a traditional patriarchal approach to life, saw the erosion of that cultural dominance, beginning maybe around the 1960s, 70s, and continuing to today. And they got scared and they panicked and they started to feel like that loss of power and dominance was persecution. I mean, this is a word you hear from Trump pretty often when he talks about his legal troubles. And so, Trump for years has been saying things like, I'm going to stop the persecution of Christians. I'm going to make sure that everybody has religious freedom, religious liberty. He talks about those themes, which are big themes among conservative evangelicals and have been for decades. Something I talk about in the book is some of the textbooks and some of the evangelical magazines and books and other media that we consumed when I was growing up. So many of them had this theme of America as this Christian nation that had been specially set apart by God and was in decline and needed to get back to this glorious past. Of course, that past wasn't so glorious for everybody, right? And certainly not for people of color, certainly not for women and indigenous people. And, that was touched on, but kind of glossed over. And in some cases, as I describe in the book, I quote some of my old high school textbooks from Christian school. In some cases, it was really minimized and even portrayed in pretty glowing terms, things like slavery. And so, I don't think that most white evangelicals think that slavery was a good thing, but I think they do see this decline of influence and cultural power. And they look around at the world, and the world can feel chaotic to anybody sometimes. And I think they see somebody like Trump as a strong figure who can restore what they feel they've lost.
Over the past couple of generations, like you said, going back to the late 1970s, the Republican Party aligns itself with Christianity. You mentioned Reverend Jerry Falwell, who founded Moral Majority, this political movement associated with the Christian right in the Republican Party.
Moral Majority endorses the flag, the family, and the freedom of speech. But to avoid endangering the group's tax-exempt status, neither national founder Jerry Falwell nor state chairman Jim Vineyard officially endorse candidates.
We don't tell people how to vote. We tell them what the issues are.
And the group did play a key role in the mobilization of conservative Christians as a political force, right? Particularly in Republican presidential victories throughout the 1980s. How, I guess, would you say that the Moral Majority and televangelists are continuing to shape the modern day Republican Party?
Well, one of the things that Donald Trump did is, he certainly is not of the evangelical movement, but he surrounded himself with evangelical leaders from across the board. And, evangelicalism is a really big movement. It's hard to define. It includes people of color, but when we're talking about evangelicals, typically people are talking about mostly white evangelical politics because, of course, white conservative Christians or white Christians in general vote very differently than Christians of color, as a group, as a voting bloc. Those voting patterns kind of map along racial lines very heavily. And that's particularly true for white evangelicals. They are the most reliably Republican voting bloc. And so what's happened over time is that's intensified. I think we've seen Trump quite intentionally aligning himself with those powerful evangelical leaders from various streams of evangelicalism, whether it's the sort of more traditional evangelical voices like James Dobson or Gary Bauer or Ralph Reed or Tony Perkins, who've led some of the traditional political movements of the evangelical right. And he's also aligned himself with, as you mentioned, Pentecostalism and charismaticism and other sort of subsects, I would call them. Some people separate, Pentecostalism and charismaticism, which are the very expressive, emotional, sort of focused on healing and spiritual gifts and speaking in tongues and a very direct connection to God. Some people separate that movement from evangelicalism. I really don't. They overlap and intersect so much. They did in my own childhood. And so some of those charismatic and Pentecostal leaders, many of them are also televangelists. I think people like Paula White and others who've built these giant ministries, some of which go on TV and, offer prayers and ask for funding. And they have the ability to mobilize a lot of people. People trust them. People follow them. It seems pretty clear from Trump's messaging early on and from his meetings with this wide swath of leaders that he understood the importance and power of this voting bloc. I was there in New York City in the summer of 2016, when just before Trump became the official nominee, when he was trying to shore up that support. And he met with about 1,000 leaders from across the evangelical spectrum, most of them white, but not all of them. He's done a lot of work to try to recruit Black pastors and Latino pastors, and he's had some success there. So the categories and the definitions get complex, but the bottom line is that Trump understands the power of conservative religious movements, and he's tapped into them very effectively.
Yeah, so many good points that you're making there, and certainly do want to point out voters of faith, not a monolith, especially when we are talking about voters of color. We know that so much of the Black church is has a history that is rooted in social justice, right? I mean, literally was central to the civil rights movement and helping to bring about a freer and fairer and more equal democracy in this country. But like you said, for many people, when they hear the word evangelical, what we're talking about typically is a white Protestant, but there are people of all walks of life who are in the evangelical church. Particularly, I want to just talk about the growing number of Hispanic evangelicals who support Christian nationalism. Right. Why do you think that there are so many Latinos joining that evangelical base right now?
Yeah, I have the same question. I mean, there's some interesting, really fascinating data out there from groups like the Public Religion Research Institute that have been looking at this, asking voters if they align with statements like being Christian is an important part of being truly American. And the U.S. government should declare America a Christian nation. Those kinds of statements that are Christian nationalistic ideas, right? And white evangelicals are the group that identify most strongly with those ideas. But some of these polls have found pretty substantial support among Christians of color as well. And so I'm fascinated by this question. It's something I want to do more reporting on. I think part of it must have to do with this sort of cultural overlap of these church communities. Many Latino pastors and even some Black pastors, share sort of a subculture, right? They'll read the same magazines, read the same books, follow the same leaders, listen to the same Christian radio. They might have differences, but there's a real cross-pollination that happens. And I think, something I talk about a lot in the book and that others like historian Kristen Kobes-Dumais have talked about is the power of that evangelical media machine and that sort of network of parallel institutions, not just media, but also universities and countless organizations that sort of wrap around churches and provide both theological teaching and often political teaching to the pastors and their followers. And so, I would have to study it more to really know, but I would certainly speculate strongly that plays a role in influencing some of these congregations of color that, might on paper, you might not think would be aligned politically with some of these ideas. But we're seeing more alignment than I think some people would expect. It's not majorities generally, but it's significant. It's noteworthy.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I want to shift to, you brought up your own relationship with the white evangelical church, your journey. I want to talk to you about what that journey was and leaving the evangelical church. What was it like for you to grow up in the evangelical church? What were you being taught?
really central to the teachings of my church and my Christian school. I went to Christian school K through 12, early preschool through 12th grade, and then for college as well, went to an evangelical college. All of it really emphasized the importance of conversion. First of all, having a personal relationship with Jesus. Other traditions may talk about that as well, but Catholicism and mainline Protestantism tend to play in those traditions. Things like ritual and liturgy and sacrament in some cases play a bigger role. So the way you're part of the group is by, maybe being baptized and confirmed, for example, or, attending certain services, following certain rituals. For evangelicals, all of that is de-emphasized. In fact, evangelicals don't practice, generally, most do not practice infant baptism. They practice adult baptism. There's this idea that you personally have to have an individual conversion experience. And then you have to take that message and that relationship with God, as it's called, to other people. And you have to get them to convert, or their souls will be in danger. The idea is that you have to not just be a Christian, but have the right understanding, the right relationship to Jesus. It has to be a real conversion, a real experience, a real relationship, or you're not saved. And there was a lot of fear of people we knew going to hell, and so there was a lot of emphasis on street witnessing. Going out a couple times as a teenager. I went out with youth groups and I handed out tracts in Kansas City to where I grew up to people who might or might not be Christians, and it would ask them if they would talk to us. I write in the book a couple of times about trying to witness to a little girl at the skating rink, because I felt like, if I didn't tell her, nobody would. And I talk a lot about my grandfather, who was one of the few people I had regular contact with growing up who was not a Christian, and who also happened to come out as gay after my grandmother passed away when I was quite young. So you put all of that together, and there was a lot of anxiety around who was going to heaven, who was going to hell. Were we doing everything right? Were we doing our part to spread the message? And that was, that was something that for me was very frightening.
Listening to you, Sarah, it's so interesting to think about, that culture of the adult conversion, working to convert others, the importance of spreading the message, and how that culture translates to our current moment in Republican politics. I mean, support of Donald Trump for so many people looks like something that borders on religious fervor. And a lot of those same dynamics seem to be present in his white evangelical followers.
Yeah, I mean, there's been some good reporting by various outlets in recent years about how, even more than in 2016, when I was dominantly covering Trump, his rallies have become much more like religious services. They often end with what almost feels like an altar call, music playing underneath a speech, which for people who've sat in a church where the pastor gets up and the worship team plays and the pastor says, if you died tonight, do you know where you would go? And have you committed your life to Christ? It has those kind of, they call that an altar call. And it has those kind of vibes. And then, there's been increasing, I think, association between Christian symbols and songs and ideas, really, with the Trump movement. You see this manifested rallies on shirts and signs and so forth. And, there seems to be a real fusion of these ideas. There's always been, of course, an alignment, between conservative Christianity and Republican politics all my life. I remember being shocked when I met some girls at college who were Democrats. Didn't know you could be a Christian and be a Democrat, which I know is so ignorant, but that was the world I grew up in. And we didn't talk about the Black church where the majority of people are Democrats. But nonetheless, that alignment's always been there. But I think it's intensified and it's become more explicitly religious than it was in the past.
And with that, we'll be right back.
In your book, The Exvangelicals, Loving, Living, and Leaving the White Evangelical Church, you spoke about what it was like growing up as a Christian and those moments when you really began to question the strictness and the tactics of the community. So for those who are not familiar with your story, can you just talk about one of the first moments that you began to really question that belief system?
I mean, there were several, and I kind of structure the book around different themes of cognitive dissonance that I experienced and that I found people talking about in online spaces. One of the reasons I wrote the book is when I was reporting on the 2016 campaign, somebody who I was talking to about Trump, or somebody who we were interviewing for a story, used the word exvangelical and said that the word evangelical had just become so fraught for some people that they didn't want to use it anymore. So I started paying attention to those online spaces, and we're talking about Facebook groups and influencers on TikTok and Instagram and hashtags on Twitter and podcasts and so forth. And a lot of these themes of cognitive dissonance were coming up again and again, not just politics, but the church's view of sexuality, particularly of women, of gay people, queer people in general, the way many evangelical churches think about science and secular authority and knowledge. All of those things became problematic for a lot of people. And I found people discussing them. And I resonated with a lot of those conversations because they reminded me of my own journey. So it's hard to say just one. It's hard to overstate the importance of my relationship with my grandfather, who, again, was a gay man who came out around age 60 in the 1980s during the AIDS crisis as a widower. This was at a time when my family was becoming deeply enmeshed in evangelicalism and the Republican politics that went with it at that time. And so that created a real clash and a real tension in my family. We're praying for my grandpa's soul at dinner. We're going to anti-abortion rallies and marches. Later, my parents were advocating against same-sex marriage, and my grandpa stood for everything opposite of that. And for me, the biggest motivator was just this fear I always had for his soul. I'd been told that long before I knew he was gay or anything, I'd just been told that he wasn't going to heaven because he didn't know Jesus, and I was so worried about him. And as I got older, got to know him better, got to know more people who thought and lived and believed differently than I did. I think all of that put together kind of caused me to expand my thinking and re-examine things. And so I became willing to re-examine a lot of things. A big turning point too was in college. Something had seemed off about the young earth creationist teachings I'd been taught both at church and at school. All my textbooks taught that the earth was 6,000 to 10,000 years old, that the Genesis account was literally true. And, it became really obvious to me that most people didn't believe that, especially most scientists. And that seemed strange. And I think also knowing my grandfather was a man of science. He was a neurosurgeon and read a lot of science, was very, very well read and thoughtful about so many things. It just made it harder for me to hold on to those beliefs. I started to feel like some of them were just obviously untrue, and others didn't align with my sense of kindness and love. And so as I got to know him better and got to sort of expand my mind and not be afraid to, it's as silly as it sounds, not be afraid to watch a show about science, things started to shift for me.
Yeah. Yeah. And so then you do come to the decision to decide to move away from the church. What was that decision like for you? And how did your family and community react when you made that choice?
Well, it was a slow and gradual and kind of gentle process. I think externally, I never wanted to hurt anyone or offend anyone. And I still felt like my faith really meant a lot to me. I valued many of the things I'd been taught. I still think that the sort of religious quest of trying to figure out what's true and right and how to live and how to treat people, and if you believe in God, what your obligations are to God, what God might want you to be doing, if you can find that out and try to do it. I mean, I think those are all really beautiful and important questions and things I'm still driven by. So it wasn't as if I had stopped being religious or spiritual, but I just didn't feel like I could accept the whole package. And I was trying to sort through what I could and what I couldn't. One thing I didn't mention, I spent some time in just a semester in college studying abroad in England. And during that semester, I visited a bunch of different Anglican churches. And because, Anglicanism is so ubiquitous, obviously, it's like the national religion. They're all in reality, there are all different kinds of Anglican churches, which have very different expressions. Some are more high church, almost like Catholic. Some are more casual, more like an evangelical experience. And then others were more fundamentalist-ish in my perception. And some were in between. And so I visited a bunch of them, and I was kind of fascinated by the way that British Christians did Christianity. I saw that it was a little bit different, and I decided for my first marriage, I got married in the Episcopal Church in the U.S., which of course is the offshoot of the Anglican Church, in part because I just really had fallen in love with the liturgy and with the sort of beauty of that form of expression. It was close enough. It was still Christianity, but it was different enough that it felt kind of more comfortable for me. And also because, quite frankly, at that time, the Episcopal Church was becoming more accepting of LGBTQ people. And that was feeling much more important to me. So, I married my Southern Baptist pastor's kid, first husband in an Episcopal church. The Episcopal priest officiated, and my former father-in-law gave a sermon, which I think was probably longer and a little more, I don't know if it was fire and brimstone, I don't really remember, but I think it was a little more pointed than maybe most Episcopalians in that church had heard. It was a little bit different style. And so over the next few years, my husband at the time and I, since we both had grown up in this, spent some time just trying out different churches and really struggling with a lot of things. And eventually, decided to not go to evangelical churches anymore. We just kind of both came to that decision together. And I would say that was still in my early 20s. And from that, it was and since then, I'm now in my early 40s. It's been just a process of trying to think through, I don't think it's a completed journey at all. It's a process of trying to think who I want to be. I go to church sometimes. I'm remarried. My husband's Jewish. I go to synagogue with him sometimes. And I feel like I take things from all of it. But what I don't want to do is to sort of consign my thinking to some other group or other person and say, here's what I'll believe because this is a list of things that this group says to believe. Maybe that's part of why I'm a journalist. It's just I just have trouble thinking that way. So that's where I am. It's probably more squishy and ambiguous than some people would like, but it's true. It's honest.
No, and I can hear that, you are still grappling, and this is still a journey that you are on, even as somebody in your early 40s. I mean, can you explain? I'm getting the sense that this is it can be a difficult decision. Can you explain how difficult it is for people to leave evangelical churches and what maybe does lead them to that decision? Some of the reporting that you found in how people arrive at that choice.
It did cause a lot of stress. With my parents, I think they were very concerned at various points. There's some very painful conversations, and it's hard when, you're not trying to hurt somebody, but you're just, a shift in thinking can feel like a shift in identity to people for whom that thinking is a big part of their identity. And that can feel like a threat or even an attack, even if it's not meant that way at all. I think for others that I interviewed, it was similar. I talked to lots of people who, and I see this in some of these groups I'm in, people sharing text messages from their parents, begging them to come back to a particular church, or, sadly rejecting their same-sex partner, or, demanding to know what they think about X, Y, or Z. And I've had those conversations, and people I talk to have had those conversations, and there's a range of experiences. I mean, some people I talk to still have close relationships with their families, and their families have been maybe even on the journey with them. I've met some people along the book tour who I met a couple, I think a mother and daughter, and I met and then a married couple who of adult children who said that they were kind of going through this process that people call deconstruction together. And so, there's a huge variety of responses, of course, because there's a huge variety of human beings. But for those for whom it's difficult, I think the consistent theme seems to be finding boundaries, sort of thinking hard about what you can and can't accept, maybe just agreeing, whether implicitly or explicitly, not to talk about certain things that are going to just cause pain. There are times that it's very hard. And, I've had times I've had to speak up because I heard things that I just didn't want to leave unchecked, or I had to have conversations with family members about what was being said and done around my own children. So that's not always a possible strategy or avenue. But I think when I've had more success, it's been around trying to focus on the things that we share, whether it's the children/grandchildren, things we're interested in, sharing family memories, stuff like that, sharing holiday meals. And for some people, it means estrangement, but for other people, it just means kind of a shift in how you operate. But I think regardless, when it is hard for family members in the community, it's very difficult for there not to be some kind of a rift, because as I said, it can feel like an attack, even if it's not. People who have very strong religious beliefs, they worry, as I've described, about people who don't. And so that sort of fear is part of it too.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so then what resources are available for people who have left the church and are in need of that community?
Well, some of them find other religious communities. There's a decent number of ex-evangelicals that end up going to mainline Protestant churches that maybe have more openness to questions or more progressive theology, particularly when it comes to LGBTQ people. The data I've seen on people who disaffiliate from Christianity in general, and that includes evangelicalism, often cite that issue as a big motivator. Evangelicals are disproportionately likely to cite their mental health as a reason they have to leave their churches. That's according to the Public Religion Research Institute. There may be really painful and unavoidable reasons why people have to make a shift, but where they go next is an important question. For some, it may be another church. For others, there's no interest in that. People I've talked to have talked about finding community in the arts and in hobbies they have, but it's not the same. And I think it's important to acknowledge that it's not this built-in weekly gathering or multiple times a week in the same way that a church is. And so there can be a real sense of loss there for a lot of people.
Yeah, I want to ask you to expound on that because we have spoken quite a bit about some of the more negative aspects of the evangelical church. But is there anything that you miss about being part of that community? And are there aspects of that community that you think that people are not talking enough about?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the community is, for those who find it, it's really powerful. And that can be present in a lot of different churches. I think one of the things that I struggled with visiting mainline churches when I was younger is that most of the congregations were quite a bit older. I was in my 20s and a lot of people were my parents' age and I had, young kids and most people didn't. And, there weren't as many services and resources available for families with children as there are in a big evangelical megachurch. I don't know if that's true in the same way that it was then. I think it's somewhat less true, but it's all, and there's also sort of like a cultural barrier. You walk into an Episcopal church and the liturgy is gorgeous, but when I first went in, I didn't understand what everyone was doing when you sit, when you kneel and all that stuff. It was so different from what I had done. And so you might trade one set of things that you would appreciate for another, but it takes time to sort of build that, widen that palette almost and figure out what the things are in that new space that work for you. I think what attracts many people to evangelicalism is this sense of like structure and guidance and a shape for your life and values. And, all of that is really wonderful. And I think that's why people are trying to find ways to preserve the good parts and while, jettisoning the things that don't work for them. Near the end of the book, I talk about a trip I took to sort of an evangelical church in Nashville where the pastor who grew up, I believe, Baptist, Southern Baptist, I think, holds these weekly gatherings of mostly ex-evangelicals, but people who kind of identify with a lot of different faith traditions or no tradition. But it's really about gathering, and they do talk about Christianity. They do talk about spirituality. They do sing songs, but there's not an expectation that you believe anything in particular. Some people, find that in maybe Unitarianism. There are a whole lot of different options, but what's going to appeal to one person won't appeal to another. And so I think that's where like the next step of the journey comes in, is sort of figuring out, okay, what have I lost? How can I replace it? Who am I now? And who do I want to be going forward? There are also, as I mentioned earlier, there's so many places online for support too. There are Facebook groups for Exvangelicals, there's one called the New Evangelicals that's a similar kind of a philosophy. There are groups about, parenting after fundamentalism, recovering from purity culture, and then of course all the hashtags and so forth that where people kind of curate some of these ideas. So there are places to find other people who are thinking about these same things or going through them. I don't want to pretend for a second, though, that online community is the same as in person. Probably somebody in a Facebook group on the other side of the country is not going to bring you a casserole when you're sick or help you move. And churches do things like that. And, that is a really wonderful part of churches. And I think it's just a challenge in our society increasingly, right? I mean, people are more and more online, more and more disconnected. There's a lot of data that backs that up. And so, I think one of the worries that I have, and I think is a fair concern about the decline of religion in general, is how do we meet some of these needs that churches have met? Of course, they haven't met them for everybody. And that's part of the problem, right? There were always people that were not included. And so how do you include people? How do you broaden the lens, but also not lose the good stuff?
Yeah. Well, Sarah McCammon, thank you so much for stopping by the amendment to help me think about and help us think about the role of white evangelicals in our society and our democracy and in this 2024 election and beyond.
Yeah, thanks, Errin. So good to talk with you.
As y'all know, the amendment aims to examine the unfinished business of our democracy and center those who are historically unheard, underrepresented, and underserved. It's built into our mission at the 19th, and it's at the heart of everything we do. And now, with literally less than 6 months to go until the 2024 general election, I'm asking you to join us in this work. So this week, the 19th kicked off our spring member drive. Every donation to our nonprofit newsroom goes towards funding our journalism. And right now, your gift will be matched dollar for dollar by the Boone Family Foundation. From covering election workers on the front lines of democracy, to the care workers concerned with disability, to childcare and aging, and the voters struggling with political fatigue, the 19th is doing the work to give those communities the information they need to be equal participants in our politics, and we would love for you to be our partner in that mission. We've made empowering women and LGBTQ+ people our business, and by donating $5 or more to our nonprofit newsroom, you can make it yours. Head to 19thnews.org/spring member drive, and thanks so much for listening this week. That is this week's episode of The Amendment, which is also a newsletter, by the way, that I write. You can subscribe to it for free by going to 19thnews.org. That's also where you can find all of our great journalism around gender, politics, and policy. For the 19th and Wonder Media Network, I'm Errin Haynes. Talk to you again next week. The Amendment is a co-production of the 19th News and Wonder Media Network. It is executive produced by Jenny Kaplan, Terry Rupar, and Faith Smith. Our head of development is Emily Rutter. Julia B. Chan is the 19th's editor-in-chief. The Amendment is edited by Jenny Kaplan, Grace Lynch, and Emily Rutter, and was produced by Adesawa Agbanile, Grace Lynch, Brittany Martinez, and Taylor Williamson, with production assistance from Lucy Jones. Our amazing theme music was composed by Jalen.